Chapter 1. Madrigan had never experienced silence. He wondered sometimes what it was like. 5 years ago, when he was nearly free, he drank and took drugs in an attempt to summon it. None of those things helped. They only made the world noisier. In the end, the only choice was to learn to control his powers. There was still no silence, but Madrigan could at least muffle the thoughts that were always around him. No matter how hard he practiced, there were certain thoughts that he couldn't keep out, couldn't ignore. Fear amplified mental voices better than anything, though anger and love made thoughts louder too. Over his life, Madrigan had learned to avoid certain places: hospitals, graveyards, police stations, prisons, wedding chapels, and sporting facilities. Ironically, the last was usually the worst, as most sentient species were stupidly invested in their team of choice. Even when he avoided problematic places, which he couldn't always do, eventually the thoughts and emotions of those around him caught up to him, like now. Screams filled the air, but they weren't as loud as the screams in Madrigan's head. He kept back, letting his associates take points. Useless, Shorvin said as he rose past Madrigan on short, stubby legs. Madrigan's hands clenched into fists. He could feel Shorvin's mind, such a weak, unfocused thing. One little push in the right place could kill him, or send him into a permanent vegetative state. Perhaps even better, a few little tweaks could alter his personality. Madrigan would love to have a slave, someone who fawned over him and took his whims as law. Focus! Geffin's grip on his arm shook Madrigan out of his fantasy. He turned to see his best friend's face inches from his own, strained and covered in a thin layer of sweat. Sorry. Madrigan looked down the hallway. He didn't need a visual, but it helped. 4 security guards huddled behind what little cover they could find. A desk turned onto its side, a chair, and one another. They popped out just long enough to shoot their blasters, making Geffin's crew scatter. Other than Geffen and Madrigan, who stood at the far end of the hallway behind the door, no one had anywhere to hide. If Madrigan didn't hurry, many people would die. The security guards would die. He and Geffen would ensure that. Madrigan wished more people on this terrible world would die, but they didn't have time for a bloodbath. He needed to focus, or else half of Geffin's crew might also die. He wouldn't mourn for Shorvin. If the Chaki wasn't so damn useful, Madrigan would have already orchestrated his death. Shorvin being useful made no difference. Madrigan couldn't kill him, not by any means. Even if the situation looked completely natural, Geffen would know. He'd look at Madrigan with disappointment, and Madrigan couldn't handle that. The second guard behind the desk had stars on the left breast of his uniform. An officer. Madrigan dropped into his mind. The first few moments were the worst. The officer's fear buffeted it like strong waves in the ocean, ready to drown Madrigan at any moment. The crew had disabled communication down here, so the guards couldn't call for help. Possibilities flashed through the officer's minds, one on the heels of the previous, as he tried to think of a way for himself and the other 3 guards to survive. With a smile, Madrigan wiped those thoughts away. The spear spiked in a wave greater than any other, so vast it threatened to encompass Madrigan. He angled himself and shot through it. He'd played with stronger minds than this, and he knew what to do. Beyond the emotions waited the brain's sorting center. Human minds were easier to read than most. Consciousness couldn't sort through all the files waiting inside, but Madrigan could. It was as easy as looking up information on his jewel. He sat in the chair in the center of a vast room. Books, files, and consoles surrounded him, going up and down as far as he could see. A lifetime of knowledge and experience waited here, most of the older parts buried under recent things. Access security code for the basement of the Treasury building, Madrigan said. The books, files, and consoles around him spun and moved, looking for what he needed. They stopped after a second, a console pushing forward before him. A series of numbers and letters showed on it, as well as a note and a memory. Madrigan stood from the chair. The mind rushed past him in reverse. The waves tried to take him again. They were stronger even than before. The sky showed an image of the outside world, which included the dead bodies of 2 of the other security guards. This man knew he was going to die. A sun hung dim over the turbulent ocean, clouds trying to obscure it. That was another manifestation of the man's fear. With a laugh, Madrigan reached for the sun. He gave a tug, and it came free from the sky. The man wailed as he died. Madrigan was expelled from the mind in time to see the last security guard turn to stare in shock as his superior fell over dead, seemingly without cause. His moment of distraction left him vulnerable. 3 of Geffin's crew shot him, and he too died. "I trust you got the code before you killed him," Geffen said to Madrigan, voice dry, unlike last time. "I got it." Geffen didn't really mean it, but Madrigan still wanted to flinch at the reminder. He'd been justified in his distraction last time, but it was still no excuse. He was supposed to be the one of the most powerful Cyraci alive. He needed to start acting like it. "You need his hand and his eyes," Madrigan pointed at the officer. "Take him to the scanner." At Geffin's command, 4 of the crew hurried forward. They hoisted up the officer, pulling him to the door at the end of the hallway. One placed the officer's hand on the scanner, while another forced his glassy eyes open. Madrigan repeated the string of letters and numbers, which a 3rd crew member typed into the pad beside the scanner. The Reckon officials thought that this system would be more secure. "Jewels are easy to hack," they told one another while the officer watched on. "Something more primitive might be better. Our DNA and retina scans, combined with a long code that only a few people know, will keep out any thieves." Though Madrigan hadn't looked for it, the memory had been prominent in the officer's memory, next to the code. With a soft ping, the door opened. The officer's body was tossed aside as the crew streamed inside. "Take whatever you can easily grab. We have 200 seconds," Geffen called as they swarmed over the treasure within. He strolled towards the door with Madrigan, He strolled towards the door with Madrigan, the 2 of them the last ones inside. Maybe the historical section of the treasury wasn't the best place. Madrigan said as he looked around inside. Wide, narrow boxes held paintings. Statues, some with bits missing, clogged one side of the vault. Those were all too big to take, and too hard to sell. The crew members found some containers with gems and jewelry, which they happily smashed. In seconds, their pockets bulged, but they kept going, taking as much as they could. 10 seconds, Geffen said, tapping his jewel. "Move, people." Most of the crew snatched 1 or 3 last items, then left the room. The group continued down the hall back the way they came, stepping over or around the corpses of the security guards. Geffen and Madrigan stayed near the center of the group. Geffen so everyone could hear his orders, and Madrigan for protection. All the security systems were still down. They were all primitive and pathetically easy for Madrigan to hack or just shut down. Only stupid, horrible people lived on Frecken. That was why they came here. Horrible people deserved to be killed and robbed, and it was easier against stupid people. The crew made it out of the building. The security guards at the main gate slept. Madrigan checked their minds to be sure. They wouldn't wake for a few more hours. The robots, which were so old that they barely counted as such, had been shut down by the guards. Their spaceship was parked 2 blocks from the treasury. Geffen had complained about this while planning the raid, wishing they could get the Otteran closer. There were no flat spaces big enough for the frigate that size. Geffen had complained about this while planning the raid, wishing they could get the otter in closer. There were no flat spaces big enough for a frigate that size, not that were closer. Madrigan promised Geffen that he'd give the crew enough time to land, make the hit, and then get out. 3 of the crew had stayed behind with the ship. The Otteran's engines hummed to life as the crew reached the park where they had left the frigate. The door opened and the ramp lowered at their approach. As soon as the last person was inside, the ramp retracted, the door closed, and the ship lifted into the air. Madrigan sank into an empty seat at the rear of the cockpit and closed his eyes. This was the hardest part of the plan. The further away a person was, the harder they were to reach. A comm channel opened. "Otteran, we don't have records of the purpose of your visit," a bored, male voice said. "You only landed an hour ago. Is something wrong?" Bored people were easier than wary people. Madrigan flung his thoughts towards the planet, searching for the person on the other end. A few miles from the Treasury building at the Space Communication Center, he found the man. He'd been working for hours, had less than 2 left until the end of his shift. Despite copious amounts of coffee and a few stims that he took when his supervisor wasn't looking, he was exhausted. The man wasn't bored, just tired. That worked just as well for Madrigan. He reached into the man's mind and stirred the waters. The exhaustion swelled, drenching everything. "We got a sudden call from back home. Back again, the pilot. We got a sudden call from back home. Back again, the pilot of the Otteran said. We have to leave. Sorry." The man yawned, loudly enough that everyone in the cockpit heard it. "What's your destination?" The Otteran was well away from the planet by now, and its weapons. As a new world that had a liking for primitive methods, Kraken had only one weapon satellite in orbit around it, which was on the opposite side of the planet at the moment. Even if anyone down there became suspicious before the Otteran jumped into hyperspace, though Madrigan was working to prevent that from happening, probably no attack would come in time to stop them. Geffen leaned in front of Back again and spoke over the comm. "Waldrick 6, he said. The man on the other end yawned again, louder this time. "Have a safe trip and come back soon." The comm channel closed. Back again let out a whoop as his antennae twitched over his head. Geffen didn't relax until the frigate made the jump into hyperspace. With a soft gasp, Madrigan slumped back in his chair. From space, it was harder to hear people on the planet unless he made an effort. In hyperspace, he could only touch the minds of those on the same ship. Perhaps if another ship flew close enough, he could hear the thoughts of those on the other ship, but Madrigan had never been able to test that. It wasn't quiet, but it was as close as he ever got. It wasn't quiet, but it was as close as he ever got. Sometimes, Madrigan thought he would like to spend most of his life in hyperspace, with a handful of people on the same ship and no one else. It would be lonely, but he'd like a few months of moon. It would be lonely, but he'd like a few months of loneliness. "Well done," Geffen told the crew as he, Madrigan, and Back again joined the rest of the crew in the large common area. The Otteran was small for a frigate, but it easily held all 50 crew members. When the rest of the crew didn't move, Geffen waved at their stuffed pockets. "Empty them out. You know the rules. Everyone shares equally." Back again nodded emphatically. If he hadn't been guaranteed part of the haul, he wouldn't have stayed aboard the Otteran. Without him, the escape would have been much harder. Madrigan left the common area. Geffen didn't need his help for this. Most of the crew were criminals, but they obeyed Geffen. No one would try to hide any of the treasure away. Crew quarters lined the lower deck, across from the large hold. A common refresher stood at each end. The quarters each had 2 bunks and 2 closets, and no more. It wasn't luxurious living by any standards, but Madrigan didn't mind. He'd lived in worse places. Here, he only had to share with Geffen. Here, no cameras watched him as he slept. Here, no one tortured him under the guise of training. He stopped at his quarters long enough to grab a change of clothes and toiletries, then headed to the nearest refresher. Hot water cascaded down on him, taking away the grime and blood. On days like this, when Madrigan had to touch many minds, he always needed a shower. Even after all these years, touching a stranger's mind made him feel dirty. He looked even paler with all the soap all over him. Madrigan closed his eyes and scrubbed harder. At least he knew better than to get distracted once inside a stranger's mind. The people on Hrekin were all horrible people. He shuddered at what thoughts he might have encountered if he'd allowed himself to wander. He'd touched such thoughts before and wanted nothing more than to avoid such people in the future. Every member of the Otterin crew was scum. Most had criminal records. The others only lacked records because the neutral and gray law enforcement agencies hadn't caught up with them yet. They were still better than the kindest and most generous people on Hrekin. After 2 minutes, the hot water shut off. The ship didn't allow more than that, not even to Madrigan or Geffen. Neutral police would be after them soon. If they were unlucky, the grave police might join in. As such, they couldn't afford to waste ship resources. Hot air switched on, drying Madrigan. He stepped out of the narrow space and pulled on fresh clothes. Finally, he felt sentient again. A few other crew members came over as he left the refresher. Most of them waved or thanked him for helping. Madrigan couldn't help but grin back. Why had he ever thought to live with